Now wave again. I forgot to press the button before. There you go. This is Alexander Hamilton for Friday, October 22nd, 2021. All right, the notes that are being passed around, you might want to pass them back that way again. Let's turn off our phones now and put them away. Thank you. Now, what I want to do today is finish up with Act 2 of Hamilton's life and begin Act 3. And then, so I'll kind of lay it out in general, and then we'll come back and finish Act 2, which is I actually want to talk a little bit about and finish our consideration of the Federalist Papers, the Federalist Papers, because there are some critical ideas in there that have to do, by the way, with the essays on Federalist 70, 71, and 72 that you wrote for last night. Remember on Monday, well here, this will give the schema for it. So the 4 acts. So again, the Revolution, which we covered, the Constitution, which we are covering, Act 3 of Hamilton's life, just as consequential as the first 2 acts, are his tenure as Secretary of Treasury, beginning in 1789 when Washington appointed him as Secretary of Treasury through 1795 when he resigned. And I know that you're tired of how many of you are absolutely sick of reading Hamilton's writings? Bless your heart. At least you're honest. There are 2 more writings that I'm going to lay in front of you. And before we actually finish with his life and then turn back to, in the next part of the course, turn back to Hamilton and look at the construction of his play. And we won't watch the whole play again, but nevertheless, as we move through Lin Miranda's book, his biography of the composition of the play, we will occasionally use scenes from the play. So, so turn to the last page, because most of this is actually filling out the material we didn't finish, and actually some quotes from the Federalist Papers that I had you look at for last night. And remember, you have another assignment for Sunday night, which is the last major writing of Hamilton on, not the last major, Hamilton's essay on the judiciary, Federalist 78. As I mentioned, Hamilton, together with Madison, by the way, and you'll see this in today's readings from the Federalist Papers that we didn't quite finish on Wednesday, Madison and Hamilton are the great architects of modern constitutionalism, a strong national government, popular opinion not channeled directly into public policy, which was the great defect of the states. They were far too democratic, turbulent. And as you'll see on Monday when we watch, and Wednesday when we watch a Tale of Two Cities, you'll see both, by the way, why Jefferson loved the French Revolution and wanted the country to support because what big thing happened in 1789? I sang this to you, and then I even sent out the song that I didn't finish on. Did you all watch that song? You Went the Wrong Way, Old King Louis. I sent it out to you on Wednesday. Did you watch that?
No.
Funny of you to think we do the work.
Funny of me to think you did the work. Well, that wasn't actually part of the work. It was just part of the enjoyment. What happened in June of 1789, Leo, in France?
The king is dead?
Not yet. But he was the storming of the Bastille.
The revolution.
That's right, with the storming of the Bastille. And let me just say, for the movie that we'll watch, this movie was made in 1935, perhaps 36, 35, I think. It's a black and white film. I already told you about this. And there are a couple of special effects that make modern young people who are raised on CGI and color films and that kind of stuff, make them cringe. But you'll also see the production values in this play, even though it's a black and white movie from some of them are remarkable, like the storming of the Bastille, in which clearly there are like 10,000 extras they used in the storming of the Bastille. So there are some, and the guillotine scenes at the end are, I think, relatively realistic. Not that, by the way, if this movie were made today, they would show the guillotine blade coming down. It would actually show it slicing through the jugular vein and the windpipe and everything. It would show the bleeding, blinking head rolling off into the sand onto the ground. So as you can see, since this movie was made before all that, it leaves it tasteful to your imagination. But it's still gripping, as you're going to see. So, so remember, your essay on Federalist 78, which completes, by the way, the other aspect in which Hamilton is the founder of modern constitutionalism, not just the big ideas with Madison, again, that I mentioned before and that we'll actually look at today, but for the essay that you read last night, he was also the architect of the modern executive, which we'll examine the parts of today, and again, the architect of the modern judiciary. Let me just say that during the Constitutional Convention, well, let me back up. There are two judicial systems in the world, basically, what's called the continental or European system and the English system, which is sometimes called the common law judiciary. And the English judicial system, which is our judicial system, we inherited from the British because we were, after all, I hope this doesn't shock anybody, a British colony. So our, no. Ach du meine Güte, oh mon Dieu, zut alors. We inherently, and here's just a little bit of history. Beginning in 1170, Henry II started the new system of English courts, and all sorts of aspects of structure and procedure that we adopted were developed over the centuries in the British common law court system. For instance, by the way, one big difference between the European system, which is in France and the rest of the continent, and the English system is what's called the adversarial system. Have you ever been arrested and been put in jail before, Leo?
He's a good kid.
I know, I just put you on the spot. If you get arrested for a crime on the continent, they will have a defending and a prosecuting attorney, but generally speaking, the judge actually conducts the trial and actually supervises both the prosecution and the defense. The English system, on the other hand, developed what's called the adversary system, where literally it's almost like a game, like a competition. The prosecution presents its defense, and then the defense presents its case, and then the defense comes in. The judge in the English system is essentially an umpire. And so in some ways, you could say, what's the advantage of such a system? Well, one advantage is it's in the interest of the defense and the interest of the prosecution to win their case. So in exactly the same way that Hamilton says that what you've got to do is make a person's interest and passion coincide with the performance of their function, whereas the defense and the prosecution in European courts tends to be more like administrative aspects of the judge. In our court system, again, what you have is a judge who's an umpire, and the defense and the prosecution come in and duke it out. And much of the whole notion of our notion of fair procedure and everything comes from that. So by the time of the American Revolution, the English court system had developed a very elaborate system of precedents and structure, which we essentially took over and absorbed. Yet, there was nothing like the idea of judicial review. The idea that the courts had the power to declare a law of Congress or an action of the executive branch unconstitutional. The answer, by the way, is contained in what I just said. If you were paying attention, let me ask you again, who actually began the English court system in 1170? I mentioned this earlier, and if you missed it, I'll repeat it. But if you caught it, who was it? Huh?
Is it like Henry something?
Henry II. And who was Henry II?
Henry
The father of Henry III. You know. He was a what? A king. To think this is being preserved for posterity, that my posterior is being preserved for posterity. Anyway, fascinating. In other words, in the British system, the courts evolved as an extension of the crown. And even the Parliament, the great constitutional struggle in Britain, how many of you concluded at this point in the course that there's something profoundly wrong with me?
I knew that before I even started. A lot of people
I'm still
talk about
figuring it out. I still hope that before I die, medical science will be able to do something for me. Anyway, so remember, the British court system developed as an extension of the crown. And even the Parliament, to some degree, was subordinate. So why, think about this, why didn't the English system develop the idea that the courts could overturn a law of Parliament or an action of the crown?
Because, the king was higher than everyone else, so what he said went.
And literally, the courts derive their authority from the crown. But, as you know from what we've seen already in this course, the American constitutional system is based upon the separation of powers and checks and balances. Here's just a little bit of history of political philosophy. The idea of modern constitutionalism essentially derives from two great political philosophers. One was English and the other one was French. Est-ce que vous avez lu le Montesquieu?
Non.
Vous avez entendu de lui?
Oui.
Okay. In Piglet, what I just said was, Av he ouye ed re Montesquieu me. John Locke, who wrote 2 treatises of government, and by the way, if you want to take my course on modern political philosophy in the spring, we will explore these great ideas and how the whole notion of modern politics, modern rights, and most of the current economic and political and social issues of the day were prefigured in the great political philosophers who founded the modern political tradition. So John Locke wrote in 1688, anybody know, if you know your British history, why was 1688 important?
Because it was.
That is a good.
Hey, my mom uses that all the
I
time.
love teaching. Have you ever heard of the Glorious Revolution? What was the Glorious Revolution in Britain? I actually taught at the school named after the people that came over to England during the Glorious Revolution. I've taught, by the way, at Carleton College, Dickinson College, I just mentioned it, William and Mary. Here is roughly a quick history of the British Constitution. The Crown and the Parliament came to a terrible civil war in 1641 with Charles I, who was the son of James I, for instance, as the King James Version of the Bible, and also Jamestown and so forth. Charles I was deposed in 1641 and then beheaded, just like Louis XVI, in 1649. We talked about this. Who ran England between 1641 and 1656? They abolished the monarchy temporarily, so who ran the country? Pardon me? Oliver, well, yes, in a way you're right. Oliver Cromwell, who was a Puritan, and it was called the Protectorate. England for actually like 19 years was actually, or about 15 years, was actually a republic. They had abolished the monarchy, and the Parliament, under the Protectorate of Oliver Cromwell, was like a Puritan radical country. But then in 1656, when Cromwell died, the English people got sick of that, and they reinstituted the monarchy in 1656, which is called the Restoration. And Charles II, Charles the first son, took over the thing. And then his son, James II, became king. And what was the problem with James II? One, he wanted to reinstitute the Catholic Church and overturn the Reformation of the church that Henry VIII, if you remember, had instituted. But by then, either Anglicanism, either the Anglican Church or the Puritan Church, England at that point had become a Protestant culture. The other thing was he wanted to return to the superiority and absolute power of the crown. So what happened in 1688 was the British people chased him out of the country, and Parliament Parliament invited 2 people, a king and a queen, to come over from Holland and become the king and queen of England. Who were those people? That's right, William of Orange. And that's when the English monarchy was literally founded upon something like parliamentary supremacy. Anyway, that's called the Glorious Revolution. Why? Because relatively few people killed. It was a relatively bloodless. Another reason was the Parliament passed another piece of important legislation called the Bill of Rights. And so an important part of the English Constitution was developed, and that's where we got the notion of a Bill of Rights in this country. The other thing then, at that time, John Locke published his great treatise, it's actually 2 treatises of government, in which he laid out modern constitutionalism. The most important feature of his constitutional theory, which we'll see reflected in what we're reading today, was the separation of powers. Locke argued that in order to prevent tyranny and present efficient government, the powers of government should be divided into 3 departments. Now here's what's interesting, this is why we need the French here. Yes, like many other times in American life, we need the assistance of the French. John Locke argued the 3 powers of government were legislative, and what's the function of the legislative branch or power?
Create laws,
And the executive,
carry out law.
and the federative. Now that kind of surprises people. Locke actually combined the executive and judicial branches because he argued those 2 branches enforce and interpret the law. The federative power was the power to engage in foreign affairs. But then it was in 1733, in l'esprit des lois, in the spirit of the laws, that the great French political philosopher Montesquieu adopted and reformulated the separation of powers so that you had now legislative, executive, and judicial. And when we turn to foreign affairs next week in Act 3 of Hamilton's life, you'll see the interesting thing about the founding is how close Madison and Hamilton cooperated in getting the Constitutional Convention going, as we saw, in moving the convention forward and getting the Constitution drafted, in collaborating in the Federalist Papers and everything. And they remained allies up until the Act 3 of Hamilton's life, because then they became first political opponents, and then, like Jefferson and Hamilton, they became political enemies. And as you're going to see, one of the aspects of the 3rd act of Hamilton's life that actually dominates the 4th act of his life is the rise of political parties in the United States. And so it was Hamilton and Washington and Adams, basically, versus Jefferson and Madison. The Federalist versus the Republican Party, more about that next week and following. So, to finish with the idea of the independent judiciary, to set up your assignment for Sunday. So even though our judiciary developed out of the English common law judiciary, there was no judicial review because there was no separation of powers and checks and balances. Here's what I want you to understand when you read the essay, Hamilton 78 for Sunday, that the idea of the judiciary declaring a law of Congress or an action of the president unconstitutional could not exist without the separation of powers. Is that clear? Do you understand that? So keep that in mind. So just to finish this, and then we'll come back to this material. During the convention, the amazing thing was there was lots of discussion about the nature of the legislature, as you saw reflected in the difference between the Virginia and the New Jersey plan. There was lots of debate about the formation of the presidency. There was almost very little commentary about the judiciary. Why is that? Because more or less we simply assumed the British common law judiciary, and it became the American common law judiciary. There was only one brief paragraph discussion of the idea that the judges could declare a law of Congress unconstitutional. It simply was not discussed very much and didn't become a theme in the convention. So where in American constitutional history do you see for the first time an extensive and original discussion of the theory of judicial review and the power of the judges to declare the other actions of the other 2 branches unconstitutional? The essay that you are reading for Sunday. Hamilton is almost single-handedly the great theorist of judicial review. And as I mentioned on Wednesday, the first great court case in our political history, 1803, where the Supreme Court actually assumed the power to declare the laws of Congress unconstitutional, Marbury v. Madison, 1803, you'll see Chief Justice Marshall almost completely absorbs Hamilton's argument in Federalist 78. So that essay, you're going to see, it's central to not only the emergence of the American Constitution, but almost all constitutional systems today have some kind of independent judiciary with something like judicial review. In France, for instance, I believe there's a separate constitutional court that actually, but you understand, that idea actually comes from Hamilton. Is that clear? Good. If you're looking at the last page of notes, what we'll be examining in Act 3 of Hamilton's, I didn't do scene division, but it's essentially the same, are these things. In the public and private and political, in the public part of his life, there are essentially 5 big issues we'll be examining. The creation of the executive branch and the judicial branches. In 1789, when the Constitution, in 1788, when the Constitution was ratified, the last major act of the old Articles of Confederation Congress in November of 1788 was to call for elections under the new Constitution. Here's an interesting question. Why have our elections always been in the fall, in November? Going back to the very beginning, and they still are. Why is our electoral season essentially in November? What were most Americans economically up until the 1900s?
Farmers.
Farmers. And that meant what?
Oh, and fall was harvest, right?
Exactly. So our electoral cycle has always been in November because by then harvest was over and farmers and agricultural people were free to come into town and vote. Does that make sense? So,
I always assumed it was just too hot, you know. and
it
they-
was too hot and pumpkins weren't ripe yet, so we couldn't have Halloween. You and I are on the same page, which should probably
That
frighten your
scares
parents
me.
considerably.
That is very scary.
I know. If you want to go for a drink afterwards, oh, I forgot, it's the Sabbath tonight.
Wait, is it really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's cool, I didn't know that.
You know the Sabbath, by the way.
I'm not,
It starts on sunset on Friday, goes to sunset. This isn't a course on Judaism. But is there actually a theme to this course? Something like it. All right, anyway. So elections were held, but it wasn't until March 4th, 1789, that Congress was able to meet. So on March 4th, Congress met, and one of its core functions, by the way, under the Constitution, was to count the electoral votes. And guess who became president?
Wait, what's the date? 89?
Who was our first president?
Washington.
Yes, our first George Washington. So that's, by the way, so for your information, this is not going to be a part on your exam. Up until 1936, our offices took office always in March. Like, for instance, one of the reasons that Abraham Lincoln had to declare war on the South, or let the South actually cause him to declare war through the firing of Fort Sumter, was Abraham Lincoln was elected in November of 1860, but he didn't take office until March 1st because we had kept this habit of starting our offices in March. But that meant there was a significant lamed up period between the election. So it was interesting, in 1860, that meant after December 21st, when the first state seceded from the Union. And what state was that?
South Carolina.
The one we're in. By the time that Lincoln took office in March of 1861, all the other 11 states had seceded and formed the Confederacy. So on one level, we've always had understood that 6-month period between the election and the taking of office was a problem. The 20th Amendment, adopted in 1936, shifted the beginnings of our office from March to January. So Congress, for instance, according to the 20th Amendment, begins its session on January 3rd and the President on January 20th. Why does Congress have to meet before the President takes his oath of office? I actually just answered that. And that's the drama you saw earlier this year on January 6th. What happened on January 6th?
Storming of the Capitol.
Because what was going on inside the Capitol?
Congress was beginning.
And what were they doing?
Discussing.
One of their core constitutional functions is to count and tabulate the Electoral College vote. And that's what was happening when the mob attacked the Capitol building. They were counting the electoral votes to declare the president. Now do you see why the 20th Amendment, going back to even the original meeting of Congress, why Congress has to meet before the president takes the oath of office? Because the presidential election is not formally concluded until the electoral votes are counted before the joint session of Congress. Is that clear? That's what we're going to do in American government today. We're going to act that out. Aren't you excited?
no.
Good to know. All right. So the government begins under the Constitution in 1789. Hamilton and Washington, of course, are busy creating the executive branch, and the Congress, by the way, actually sets up the legislative foundation for the legislative and executive branches. Second, which you know from the play, but also from what you've read, the first great crisis was the assumption of state, continental, and even private debt. Hamilton's debt assumption scheme. And you remember the scene in the play what that results in? You remember the song, The Room Where It Happens? That's because James Madison and Thomas Jefferson got together with Hamilton. They agreed to support his debt assumption plan, by which, and this, as you're going to see, this is the big question that we're going to end this course with. What was the meaning of Hamilton's plan for the national government to assume the debt of the states and the debt of the old Congress and of the, to some degree, the private debt of the war? It has to do with the nature of modern public finance. Because not only was Hamilton one of the major originators of constitutional theory and the modern executive and the modern judiciary, Hamilton, in some ways, is the great original founder of modern capitalism and the modern financial system. So in some ways, that's what you see. Why did he think it would be a good idea? Because most of us want to be debt-free, don't we? And yet, his first major act in government as Secretary of the Treasury was to have the Congress and the national government assume the debt, to actually take on more debt. Isn't that counterintuitive? And yet, as Chernow says, a certain amount of debt, he says, could be a blessing. And that's why the last book we're reading in this course is Hamilton's Blessing. So Hamilton's creation of the notion of public debt as an asset. And that, by the way, as you're going to see, is in some ways, that question is still at the heart of our national politics today, as you'll see. All right. But of course, what was the big deal? Jefferson and Madison agreed to support his assumption of debt in Congress for what plum?
Placing the capital.
Right, the movement of the capital to Washington, D.C. The third is the great controversy over the national bank. When I teach this in American government, students are often astounded to discover that one of the major controversies that nearly split the nation apart was the creation of a national bank. Do we have a national bank today?
Yes.
Yes, what's it called?
Oh.
The Fed. It's the Federal Reserve is actually the third national bank of the United States. Third, and by the way, if you note, I put Modern Finance 1, that was the assumption of debt and the creation of public debt. Modern Finance 2 was the idea of a national bank and the role. All modern capitalistic economies, and not just capitalistic economies, all modern economies now have national banks as a foundational institution. Even the People's Republic of China, even Russia, even Germany, all modern nations that conduct any kind of finance, whether it's capitalistic or socialistic, have a national bank. Hamilton was the great originator of that concept. The third was his report on manufacturers, because as Joe pointed out, most Americans were farmers. Hamilton had the great vision of a giant continental nation founded on commerce and manufacturing. And so in some ways, he was instrumental in that aspect of the development of our nation. And the last major issue we'll discuss in Act 3 of his life is the emergence of foreign policy. And the first great foreign policy question, and this is what leads to our viewing of A Tale of Two Cities on Monday, is the French Revolution. And why is that important? Who helped us win the Revolutionary War in our own country? Les Français. And then we built for them the Eiffel Tower. That's not true.
But we built for you the Statue of Liberty.
That is correct.
The Statue of Liberty.
They didn't offer it to us first, though.
I know, but they gave it to us.
Eventually.
How many of you have ever been inside the Statue of Liberty?
I've been to Eiffel Tower, not Statue of Liberty.
I've been up into the torch.
Really?
Yes.
Lucky.
In fact, by the way, in addition to being able to sing the 4 verses of the Star-Spangled Banner, here is the poem by the young Jewish poet Ezra Lazarus that's at the foundation. Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame with conquering limbs astride from land to land. Here, at our sea-washed sunset gate shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning. Keep, ancient powers, your storied pomp, cries she with silent lips. Send me the tempest, the hungry, the tempest tossed. Send these, the homeless, to my shore. The rest of you can just go to hell. I paraphrased the last part. My mother, who just passed away, one of the great points of my life was when I was supposed to be moving to Israel to become the assistant director of a public policy institute. Can you imagine that? I lived in New York for half a year, and my mother came to say goodbye after I just finished defending my dissertation. And so I took her to a Broadway musical.
What musical?
42nd Street.
Yeah.
Come and meet those dancing feet on the avenue. I'm taking you to 42nd Street. And then we also went to the Statue of Liberty, and we were both so intensely patriotic. The closer we came, we just fell into each other's arms and wept. People thought we were probably lovers.
Did
which-
you really cry?
Oh, what do you think? I cry at the drop of a hat.
Oh, I wish I had had to drop.
Well, I dropped my mask.
Oh, I thought you were gonna drop your yarn.
So it turns out that one of the things we did was to conclude a treaty of mutual assistance with the French government. But who was the French government in 1781? Louis the
Something.
16th. In other words, monarchical France is with whom we concluded the agreement. But what happened in 1789?
He was dead.
La Révolution Française. So what's the foreign policy issue that developed in 1792 and 1793, the first great foreign policy crisis of the Washington administration? Because even though it was revolutionary France, it seemed at that time that what the French people liked to do more than anything else was be at war with England. And so even though it was monarchical England that was at war with France during our Revolutionary War, what was obviously the great foreign policy question? Once the French Revolution happened, what's the question? They turned to us for assistance in their war against England. What was the great foreign policy question? You may have read this already. Should we honor that treaty of mutual assistance with France and enter the war with revolutionary France against England? And as you're going to see, that led to Washington's first great foreign policy crisis and what, as Chernow describes, the proclamation of neutrality. And so the last two major writings, by the way, that you're going to read actually by Hamilton's hand in this class, is I'm going to put in a little bit of when he defended the right of the president to do that. That became an important constitutional question. And the last thing is Washington's farewell address, which Hamilton essentially wrote for Washington. After that, no more original writings of Hamilton. All right. So, now, by the way, on the private side, remember what's happening during this time too. His law practice is growing. Hamilton was a brilliant courtroom lawyer, and this is, by the way, as Chernow points out, this is where he begins his both friendly and then rivalry and then enemy association with Aaron Burr. Second is the growth of his family. And last, of course, as you know from the play and also from the documentaries, the sordid affair with Maria Reynolds and the attempt on the part of her husband to bribe them, and Hamilton's own sabotaging.
Were her and her husband together on it?
Yes.
Okay, that's what I thought. I was like thinking about it.
And as you all know, how did Hamilton react to that?
The Reynolds pamphlet. I was like.
So in other words, as you know, what was his first piece of writing that published and launched his life?
The Hurricane.
The Hurricane. And that's why the song, In the Eye of a Hurricane, because what was Hamilton's response? In a sense, it's his natural characteristic response to all the issues of his life. To take up a pen and write like crazy. And so in some ways, this interesting act of self-defense, the Reynolds affair, is also, as you're going to see, what sabotaged his future political career. All right, more about that later. So, what I want to do is, if you turn back, here's where we finished on Wednesday. We're reading through some critical aspects of the Federalist Papers. So what I'm going to do the rest of the day is finish the vision of human nature, and because as I make the point in my American government class, not only were institutions created, do you need the notes?
Oh, good.
Okay. Joe, would you help out?
Oh, Marcel, you say this.
Oh, no, oh look, I don't care what you say about Madison, she's actually a very nice person. I'll never forget you for this. This way, I'll have one for each eye. I can read it in stereo. All right. So, where we left off was Brian reading two statements from Hamilton, Federalist 1 and Federalist 2, Federalist 11. Why is that important? Because you got from his speech, by the way, that Hamilton favored a very vigorous national government. And he actually says, probably the most single shocking thing he says in his speech was, I don't particularly care about the states. It wouldn't bother me if we got rid of them. I don't know if you can understand how shocking that was. Now, don't forget, the Constitutional Convention was not a public event. You understand that. Because on the first day, on May 25th and May 26th, their opening days, they had voted to keep it completely secret, which they basically managed to do. What did that mean? Why did they do that? Clearly it meant that the people inside could stand up and
Oh,
say
because they
things.
didn't want to cause an uproar, right?
And can you imagine what the public response to what Hamilton says on June 18th would be to abolish the states? And remember, and I pointed this out in some of your essays, he doesn't actually call for the abolition of the states, but he clearly wants them almost to be sidestepped in the direction of, and you might have missed this interesting detail. He wants the governor, remember the president for life? He wants them to appoint the governors of the states. Do you understand what a remarkable how different our constitutional system would be today if the states had no semi-sovereign authority and if the president appointed the governors? Now that would be, by the way, an imitation of the British Constitution, because who appointed the royal governors of the colonies?
The king.
So in a way, and I pointed this out on some of your essays, Hamilton was accused of wanting to reinstate the British monarchy. That's probably not true. Although he did, in fact, advocate, as you know, a president for life. So, what, by the way, on this question, if Hamilton were sitting here today and had the patience to sit through this class, and you said to Hamilton, all you wanted was the British Constitution, the British monarchy, what would Hamilton say in response?
No.
I'm sorry, I meant to tone that down a bit. What would he say?
Wait, did you do your actual figures?
I did it first.
Oh, I've never seen you do that.
On prosthetics, actually.
Well, I know. I'm astounded these things actually still work after 69 years of reckless living. Considering, by the way, I think you remember when I stuck my finger in a blender earlier this semester.
Yeah.
I actually moved my own stitches myself rather than going after paper.
Why did you do that?
Oh, it just seemed like the thing to do. No, it's because it was an immersion blender and I just made delicious fishy
No, I'm asking
slices.
about the stitches. I don't care about the blender.
Oh, because first of all, I didn't want to, so I just pulled them out myself. I'm not sure I'll ever do that again. So don't try this at home. Don't pull out your own stitches. Anyway, it worked. Sorry. Where were we? What would Hamilton say in response to the charge that he simply wanted to replicate the British monarchy? Well, let me ask you this. How was his plan like the British monarchy?
Having one executive.
One executive for life. But what would Hamilton say? Why isn't this like the British monarchy? What would distinguish his president from the British crown?
Held accountable for him being punished.
How? By the way, yes, he would be impeachable. That's one. I guess you could say this. You could always behead the king. Both the British and the French have done that. Or chase them out like they did with James II. Why would Hamilton say my president, or my governor, he called it, is not the king, even if it's single and serving for life?
It's elected.
First of all, it's elected. The British monarch, if you remember, is hereditary, which is one of the reasons they got Diana in trouble. And who's the one that's going to inherit the king? By the way, actually, you know, Queen Elizabeth just turned 95.
Oh yeah, did you see she spent the night in the hospital yesterday night and she had to cancel her trip to Ireland?
She is the longest sitting British monarch. Who's second? You know, by the way? Victoria. So anyway, so actually still Prince Charles, if she dies, actually Prince Charles is still in line to inherit the monarchy.
Wait, who is that, her son?
Yeah, that's her son,
Okay, that's what I thought.
Diana's husband or Camilla's husband. And if he abdicates or doesn't take up the throne, who will become king then? I always forget, who's the oldest one of the two boys?
It's William.
William. Harry is with Meghan over here,
Yeah,
right?
you wanna know something crazy?
So,
I-
can you see the problems with a hereditary monarchy? So by the way, it's hereditary, and of course, it's also lifelong, but there's no, what Hamilton would call, and this is what he develops in Federalist 70, Republican responsibility. The president is elected, and by the way, draws the presidential powers not from the British people in general, but mediated through the Constitution. And as you're going to see, that's part of the plan for the modern executive that he lays out. All right, so where we went as far on Wednesday was not only did Hamilton have the idea of a strong national government, he wanted clearly America to be what we would call a great power, a great nation. Would that have ever happened under the Articles? No. Would it have ever happened under the New Jersey Plan? It might not have happened under the Virginia plan, but clearly, one of the things that Hamilton did was influence not only the convention to reject the New Jersey plan, but if you look at his plan of government, the final resonance in Article 2, because remember, there's one other detail that he played, a role that he played in the convention. In the Committee on Style from September 5th to 12th, my birthday, Hamilton was on the 5-person Committee on Style that actually drafted the final language of the Constitution. So just look at the Constitution, look at Article 2, and look how much it bears a similarity to his plan. So while it's not simply true that Hamilton's governor or president is our presidency under the Constitution, nevertheless it probably owes more to Hamilton, the presidency, than to any other single individual in the convention. Now, Hamilton wanted a great nation. Now what I want to do is I want to look at these two extensive quotes from Federalist 10 and Federalist 51. These are by James Madison. Because when you stand back and look at the American founding and say, what was unique about the American founding? Not only because, as Hamilton says in Federalist 1, it was actually open and discussed and rational. In fact, by the way, there's a great book, let me recommend it to you, by Emil Reed Amar, AMR. He's a great constitutional scholar at Yale. He has a wonderful book on the Constitution called The Constitution, a Biography. And in it, he shows that the Constitution at that point in time was the most openly and democratically discussed and elected institution of government in the history of the world. Now, the point here is, but if you step back from that and say, what was unique, what was interesting about the theory of the approach to human beings or government in general? And so I'm going to start with you, Nicole, and you see number 2 on page 2 of the notes. An overall way of describing the theory of the Constitution is a rejection
of utopianism and an attempt to ground society and its institutions upon a frank and realistic theory of human nature.
And by the way, where does that begin? It begins with the Declaration of Independence. Because, let me recite and mangle the first 2 paragraphs of the Declaration, La Déclaration de l'Indépendance. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bounds which have hitherto connect them to another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal status to which, now listen very closely, the laws of nature and nature's God. So ultimately, and let me continue, decent respect for the opinions of mankind entitles them to declare the causes which impel them to separation. Paragraph 2, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Yada, yada, yada. All right, so why is that important? The Declaration, in terms of providing a rationale for the American Revolution, looks to what final authority? Even beyond the people and the consent of the governed. What makes the teachings of the Declaration on human equality and human rights true? They come from where? According to the Declaration, where do our rights come from? What makes us equal?
Being human and God.
Well, and the missing term that I want to stick in your ears is nature. Remember, these philosophies came from the Enlightenment. La Lumière, is that right? And the core idea of the Enlightenment is to replace superstition and even religion in politics with a foundation based on nature, reason, and human nature. Now, of course, it also says, endowed by their Creator, laws of nature and nature's God. Well, let me just ask you this. How many of you believe in gravity?
I don't know about that one, Chief.
All right, well, watch. Proved again.
Kidding.
All right. How many of you believe in God?
I don't know, man.
Do you have to believe in God to believe in gravity?
No.
Can you believe in God and believe in gravity?
Yes.
So in other words, gravity is part of the natural world. And interestingly enough, you probably all heard of Charles Darwin, right? His great work, The Origin of Species. What most people don't know is that people think Darwin overturned God and replaced it with evolution. Yet in chapter 9 and in chapter 11 and 14 of The Origin of Species, Darwin says the guiding of evolution over millions of years is by the divine finger. So on one level, to go back to the American founding, it starts with an affirmation of human nature. the naturalness of human nature as the beginning point of reflecting about government, even if it attributes some of that to the creator. Does that make sense? So what actually is that theory of human nature? That, by the way, you see reflected in Hamilton's theory of the executive. So, Madison, returning to you. So, what about human nature? And this is from Federalist 10, because these two great theoretical essays, Federalist 10 and 51, 10 on the nature of society as being driven by factions and contentiousness, and Federalist 51, which is the great essay on separation of powers, as you'll see in a minute. What is it about human nature that's a problem? Go ahead.
The latent causes of faction are thus sown in the nature of man.
So by the way, have you ever been disappointed by human beings?
Yes.
Have they ever failed to rise to your lowest expectations? And one of the things that Madison is developing in this essay is most human societies, all human societies, there's a tendency to fall into squabbling, self-interested factions. That's by way of preface. But I want to unpack this sentence for you. The latent. You know what the word latent means? What's the word latent mean? When something is latent as opposed to open.
Sleeping.
Yes, by the way, hidden, dormant. And if they're latent, the very causes of this behavior in human beings is latent in the nature of man. What is Madison saying about this icky tendency of human beings to blow each other up? Where is it rooted?
Greed?
I don't know.
Just what we're talking about.
What's that on?
Yeah. So that means if you're going to create a perfect society, and this is in my American government classes where I like to actually contrast Marx, who of course Marx hadn't written yet, Marx wasn't born yet, but the great theorist of modern socialism and communism, who argues, by the way, that you can do exactly what Madison says you can't do here. Marx actually argues you can create a society where there are no factions, there are no tensions, there are no classes, because you have done what? You have reshaped human nature. Now let me tell you, if you're going to take it as your purpose to reshape human nature, get out the machine gun and the gas chamber and the gulag. So whatever you want to say about Madison, he may not have been a philosopher like Marx, but here he says the fundamental insight of the American Constitution. So continue to read.
And we see them everywhere brought into different degrees of activity according to the different circumstances of civil society. A zeal for different opinions concerning religion, concerning government, and many other points, as well of speculation as of practice.
So by the way, what he's raising here is what kinds of things tend to drive people into contending and squabbling factions. Have you ever heard of different opinions on religion? In fact, wouldn't you say that much of the evil that humanity has caused to each other throughout our 7,000 years of political existence has become either because of monarchs and tyrants who rule in the name of God or the gods, and who burn people at the stake because you have a different opinion of religion? Wouldn't it be nice if we didn't have that? What else tends to drive people into contending factions?
An attachment to different leaders, ambiguously contending for preeminence and power.
Do you think people form different attachments to different charismatic leaders? How many of you have ever heard of never Trumpers? And yet, how many of you know people who would lay down on the road for Trump? I'm not advocating one way or another, but isn't it true that demagogic leaders can somehow appeal to the people's passions? Have you ever actually listened to a speech of Adolf Hitler's? You can tell that man understands something about how to awaken human passion. Go ahead.
Or to persons of other descriptions whose fortunes have been
Fat, old, and Jewish.
who have been interesting to human passions, have, in turn, divided mankind into parties, inflamed them with mutual animosity, and rendered them much more disposed to vex and oppress each other than to cooperate for their common good.
Go ahead. This is a great sentence, the next one.
So strong is this
Propensity. What's a propensity? A tendency. Go ahead. Yeah.
of mankind to fall into mutual animosity, that where no substantial occasion presents itself, the most frivolous and fanciful distinctions have been sufficient to kindle their unfeeling passions and excite their most violent conflicts.
The last sentence.
But the most common and durable source of factions have been various and unequal distribution of property.
The rich versus the poor. So by the way, let me just say this. What Madison is saying is people are so shitty that when they don't have a good reason to fall into squabbling factions, they'll find some stupid reason. Can I give you a quick example before I let you go? My first full-time teaching job was at Dickinson College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Dickinson was a very big fraternity school. There were 12 fraternities. And I can't remember now, was it Sigma I Delta Phi or Sigma Delta Munuba? They had a national rivalry, and they had a local rivalry. And one midnight, the members of Sigma got into the athletic locker and took out all the bows and arrows. They positioned themselves against the fraternity house of the other one and shot arrows into their window. At the last minute, some student from the other fraternity heard the noise, got up, looked through the window, and an arrow just brushed his ear. Now, stupid fraternity prank. For 2 millimeters, what could have happened? Yeah, these two kids, they could have destroyed their lives. Isn't that a stupid reason to threaten somebody's life? That there's a sigma in your name as opposed to a delta? Madison was correct. See you on that.
Can I sit in here until done?
Sure. Will cost you extra.
Like, buy you a yarmulke?
All right. So, anybody, would anyone like my news mask?
Me?
Oh, get away. Well, it worked.
I was really surprised I got a B